Well, good afternoon. It's so good to see you all here. And welcome to the 2024 Hibernian Lecture. My name is Darren Dochuk. I'm on the faculty here in the Department of History. And with my colleague, David Lantigua, I also co-direct Notre Dame's Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the staff and fellows of the Keogh Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, which is co-sponsoring today's lecture. We'd also like to extend a very special welcome to members of the Ancient Order of Hibernians and Ladies Ancient Order of Hibernians who are with us today, and we are going to have, again, a wonderful talk and a celebration dinner later. Thank you all again for joining us. For more than 40 years, the Hibernian support has enabled the Cushwa Center to promote the study of Irish and Irish American history and culture in a variety of ways. The centerpiece of the Cushwa Center's commitment to Irish studies has long been this annual Hibernian Lecture. And I'm very pleased to welcome Frank Shovlin back to Notre Dame as our Hibernian Lecturer this year. Professor Shovlin is Professor of Irish Literature and English at the University of Liverpool's Institute of Irish Studies, where he teaches courses on Irish fiction, the Irish Literary Revival, and contemporary Irish drama. He holds degrees from University College Galway and St. John's College, Oxford. Professor Shovlin's research interests span the past 150 years of Irish literature. In recent years, as we'll hear today, his research has focused on the life and work of novelist John McGahern. Frank is the author of numerous articles and book chapters, as well as 4 monographs, including the Irish Literary Periodical, 1923 to 1958, and Journey Westward, Joyce, Dubliners, and the Literary Revival. In 2016, his monograph, Touchstones, John McGahern's Classic Style, was published by Liverpool University Press. He edited the Letters of John McGahern, published in 2022, and he is currently writing McGahern's authorized biography. The title of today's lecture is Like a Prayer, The Novels of John McGahern. Please join me in welcoming Frank Shovlin.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here again in Notre Dame. And I'd like to thank the university, the Cushwa Center, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and the Ladies Ancient Order of Hibernians for the opportunity to deliver the lecture today. When I was first approached about possibly speaking to you, I was immediately drawn to the idea of addressing the AOH, an organization with which my family has ties going back to the 19th century. While my specialism is Irish literature, and I intend to focus mainly today on certain aspects of the novels of John McGahern, I hope you won't mind if I speak briefly about the role the AOH played in my family's life. My great-grandfather, Hugh Shovlin, was born in 1873, one of 8 children to Frank and Nancy Shovlin, in a 2-room stone cottage in the townland of Sandfield, parish of Ardra in southwest Donegal. All that's left of that house is the middle photograph there. My first cousin is standing there on a cell phone in the old cottage. Hugh's father, known as Wee Frank, had previously mined for coal in northeastern Pennsylvania with his brother James. There, they likely got involved with a secretive organisation known as the Molly Maguires. On their return to Ireland, they were arrested at the port of Belfast with a large sum of money on suspicion of being Fenians. Fenians, as most of you will know, were members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, sworn to overthrow British rule in Ireland. Now, whether they were Fenians or not, I can't say. And it may well just be they had the money, as most men who came back in that period had the money to try and buy farms back in Donegal. And they made their way back to Sandfield. Aged 15, Wee Frank's son, Hugh, my great-grandfather, emigrated from the port of Derry via Philadelphia to work in the copper mines of Butte, Montana. The work was dangerous but well paid, and he made enough money over the following decade to buy a small farm back in Sandfield, While in Bute, he became a member of the ancient order of Hibernians. When Hugh came back to Ireland, he married a woman called Bridget Sweeney, and they had 9 children, many of whom would in turn emigrate to America. Hugh, clearly having found sustenance and support with the AOH in Bute, set about, along with other Donegal men, returned from the mines of Montana, including his brother William, founding a division of the AOH in Down Strands, the area in the parish of Ardra that includes the Sandfield. This became division number 518, as you can see in the slide here. One of Hugh's 9 children, Peter, born in 1912, was my grandfather. He managed to stay in the area, keeping a small farm and opening a guest house in the little coastal community of Nairn. He inherited his father's interest in the AOH and became branch secretary for many years. And you can see there his lapel badge and his minute book. I've also given you a photograph of the view from Sandfield out onto the Atlantic Ocean and the beach there. It's spectacularly beautiful place. I said that to my grandfather once, that he had grown up in a very beautiful place. And he said to me that as a boy, all he could see was desolation. Beauty isn't much use to you if you're hungry. But that beauty and the beginning of tourism in Donegal gave him a living. And he and his wife, Nora Gilday, went on to have 7 children, the eldest of whom is my father, Frank. As you can see, we don't have much of an imagination when it comes to naming boys in the Shovlin family. My 14-year-old son is also called, inevitably, Frank. 1912, the year the Titanic sank, the year my grandfather was born, was also the year in which the Down Strands Hibernian Hall was built, just a short distance from Kilclooney Chapel. It was used for meetings and fundraising dances for many years. In more recent times, it fell somewhat into disrepair, but in the past few months, with the help of local fundraising, it's been awarded a small government grant for refurbishment and hopefully will become a vibrant part of the community down there in Kilclooney and Nairn again. In 2015, the AOH National Gathering took place in Donegal town, and the march began right in front of my parents' house there. And I took these few photographs. I was struck by the splendor of its banners, by the quality of the bands, and the fact that it seems to be an almost entirely Ulster-based organisation, with bands from Cavan, Tyrone, Derry, and elsewhere in Ulster. Thus ends my short diversion into my AOH links and the Shovlin family. And now I want to turn to the meat of my talk, which is my expertise, which is on the Irish writer John McGahern. Who was John McGahern and why should you care? He was born in 1934 and died in 2006, and is usually considered Ireland's greatest writer of fiction of the past 60 years. He published 6 novels and 4 collections of short stories. His second novel, The Dark, was the last serious work of fiction to be banned in Ireland in 1965. And I travelled up here from North Carolina, where I'm based this year at the National Humanities Centre. I went to an event in Raleigh on Tuesday night in a bookstore there. I hadn't realised that this is Banned Books Week. So it's suitable that I'm going to talk a little bit about a banned book. Banning books in Ireland essentially ended with the banning of The Dark in 1965, 60 years ago. But I'm conscious that book banning is a live political issue here in the US today. I teach a course on censorship in Liverpool, and it's something that my students are very interested in. I'll come back to talk about The Dark in a bit. McGahern's 5th novel, Amongst Women, which follows the life of Moran, a disgruntled IRA veteran of the War of Independence, as he sees out the last of his days among his wife and daughters, were shortlisted for the Booker Prize and turned into a BBC TV series. McGahern went on to have great popular success with a final novel, That They May Face the Rising Sun, recently turned into a film and published here in the US as By the Lake, and his memoir in 2005, published in the US as All Will Be Well. In this photograph, you see McGahern as a boy out in a boat with his sisters. He had a sad childhood, his beloved mother dying when John, the eldest child, was just 9. The Ireland in which John grew up was not all that far removed from the Ireland of my grandfather and great-grandfather. Asked once to recall the overriding impressions of his childhood, John provided a memorably sensuous portrait. A lurid light, always, especially the red light burning in front of the picture of the Sacred Heart. A smell of sour potatoes. Whole cargoes of them would be boiled and the leftovers kept for the pigs and hens. It was an Ireland that had changed little in a century, a poor, rural country of limited opportunities. This is McGahern's description of it. There were few luxuries of any sort. Ireland in the 1930s was essentially a 19th century nation, with 19th century sites, horses and carts on the road, people cutting their own turf for fuel. There was no electricity. It was all candles and oil lamps. 90% of people lived in appalling poverty, but it didn't feel poor. The most attractive thing about Irish society then and now is its lack of class consciousness. Everybody was equally badly off. I don't think that's so true anymore, but I think it was when McGahern was writing that. While there's no doubting the primitive living conditions of most rural Irish people at this time, John is not quite right about the equal spread of deprivation. His own parents, for instance, both held pensionable state positions and never had to consider emigration, as so many of their peers in the early decades of post-independence Ireland did, with over 2 million Irish leaving the country in the first 80 years after the British withdrawal. These figures peaked in John's childhood and youth. The 15 years after the end of the Second World War saw 500,000 of his countrymen leave Ireland. After the death of his mother in 1944, John and his 6 siblings moved in with their father to the Garda Barracks in Coothall, County Roscommon. This is a family photograph here. The lady on the end of the photograph is not John's mother. I don't know who that woman is, but behind there is Sergeant McGahern, Sergeant Frank McGahern, the father of the 7 children. John's father was a veteran of the Anglo-Irish War of 1919 to 21, who, as a pro-treaty IRA volunteer, was among the first men to join the new police force on Garda Síochána. As a father, he could be brutal and cruel, and John writes in the dark and in his memoir of the types of abuse, both physical and sexual, that he suffered at his father's hands. Determined that his siblings would not suffer in the same way, he decided that if he had to, he would kill his father, knew where the rifle was kept, and decided to use it one day if needs be. Fortunately, that day never came, but his relationship with his father was always strained, and the figure of a difficult and angry father figure peoples many of his novels and stories. When I was approached last year to write a chapter on McGahern for a forthcoming Cambridge history of the Irish novel, it got me thinking about his relationship with that particular literary form. Did John McGahern ever even write a novel? It's clear that he had his doubts. Writing to the trustees of the Macaulay Fellowship while still composing his first published book, The Barracks, he attempts to describe the aims and motivations of the work. As it is not a novel, but an attempt to break that form down into a religious poem, I can only hope to indicate some of its tones as it moves to its end. The vision is all that matters in it, and the style, for a banality in it can assume as much importance as the beautiful. In one of his earliest published interviews, McGahern describes his work as, quote, a religious activity, which is keeping faith to the sources of one's own being, and it is, in the pure sense of the words, a form of praise and of prayer. The idea that what he is writing is something closer to prayer than to fiction occurs again in his composition of the Dark. Writing to his friend and fellow writer Michael McClaverty in the wake of the book's banning under the terms of the Censorship of Publications Act 1929, McGahern was pained by the wanton and blinkered misreading that had led to the controversy. The appeal board have rejected the plea for the Dark, he writes. I may be asked to leave. I don't see any other alternative than to go to London then. What disturbs me very much is that the book's a religious work, if it's anything at all. The book having been banned in October 1965, McGahern was dismissed from his teaching post in a Dublin Catholic boys' school at the behest of Archbishop McQuaid. The censorship board did not have to give any reason as to why a book was banned. They would just have to say that the book was in general tendency obscene. So we don't know why the book was banned, although we can speculate. The book uses the F word on the first page as a kind of deliberate test, I think, by McGahern. In London in 1960, you'd had the trial of Lady Chatterley's lover, where there was a great deal of discussion about the use of the F word. And I think McGahern was testing the Irish censorship system to some degree. The book is also the first book to talk about sexual abuse in the home and clerical sexual abuse published in Ireland. And I think McGahern was disappointed and upset the book was banned, but not surprised. While knowing that the Dark might be banned, it wounded John that the book had been essentially labelled as pornography and lumped in with other restricted books in 1965, many of them designed for cheap titillation. Far from seeing his own novel as sexually inappropriate, he considered it, as he told McClaverty, a religious work. Despite all its sexual explicitness, maybe even because of it, religious does seem like an entirely appropriate word to use of the Dark. At its core is the confusion in a sensitive adolescent boy's mind between whether he should choose a life in God as a priest or a life in pursuit of what a Catholic education teaches one to think of as the world, the flesh, and the devil. In an attempt to make up his mind, he goes to stay with his cousin, Father Gerald, who gets into the boy's bed and caresses him on his first night in the house. Besides this initial shocking introduction to a casual abuse of clerical power, Father Gerald is actually drawn sensitively and seems to understand very well the nature of the boy's turmoil. While The Dark is the first work of Irish fiction to lift the lid on clerical sexual abuse, that blight that became a national obsession and disgrace as it was increasingly exposed from the 1990s onwards, it would be a mistake to think of John as anti-clerical in his thinking. Like young Mahony of the novel, John thought seriously as a boy that he might have a religious vocation that would lead him to a life in the church. It seems likely that, as described in the leave-taking and in memoir, he made promises to his dying mother about a future in the priesthood. Her passing when he was 9 forced him at a very young age to think about the shortness of life, about death, and about the meaning of it all. Were John to become a priest, he could honour his mother's memory and attempt to conquer death. Yet to enter the priesthood for this reason, as his characters realise again and again throughout the fiction, never quite works. Patrick Moran, of McGahern's third novel, The Leave-Taking, while still a young boy, promises his devout mother that he will one day become a priest and say masses for her. Much of that novel is about how he copes with the guilt of not keeping that promise after his mother's early death. In a key passage, he reflects on the choice and on the possibly sacramental nature of sexual instinct. The true life was death in life, the sexual life was destruction, the sweet mouth ruin. In my end was my beginning. One day I would say mass for her. Could not the small acts of love performed with care each normal, mysterious day be a continual celebration, as much as the surrender of the dream of woman would allow the dubious power of the laying on of anointed hands? Though framing the statement as a question leaves us in doubt as to the narrator's commitment, his decision to marry and stay with Isabel, his American lover, and thus to lose his teaching post, is one of the best examples in John's work of the religious, even priestly nature of romantic love. And this is the quotation on your slide. My love waits for me in a room at Howth. The table will have bread and meat and cheap wine and flowers. Tomorrow we will go on the boat to London. It will be neither a return nor a departure, but a continuing. We will be true to another and to our separate selves, and each day we will renew it again. It is the only communion left to us now. O soul full of grace, pray for me, now and at the hour. O pray for us both. Even now I feel the desperate need of prayer. For John, that stark religious need is sated again and again by the transcendent power of writing. John's continuing admiration for aspects of Catholicism and his many friendships with priests over the course of his life is all the more remarkable given the unhappy times he experienced in the shadow of church power. He describes, for instance, his time in Catholic Teacher Training College in stark terms. We were being groomed as non-commissioned officers to the priests in the running of the different parishes throughout the country, cogs in an organizational wheel, secondary to the priest in all things, including education. That subordinate role is brought to terrifying life in his short story, The Recruiting Officer, when the teacher narrator, a former Christian brother, witnesses the savage beating of a boy by the school manager, Canon Riley, with a length of electric cable. In a half circle, the beating moves, the boy trying to sink to the floor to escape the whistle and thud of the wire wrapping round his bare legs, but held up by the arm, the boy screaming, and the heavy breathing of the priest filling the silence of the faces, watching from the long benches in frightened fascination. John, for the majority of his life, did not believe in God, nor practice the Roman Catholic faith, into which he was born. Yet in spite of that, his fiction stands among the most interesting and lucid engagements with religion generally, and with Catholicism specifically, provided by any Irish writer. Far from having no religious feeling, as one critic writes of John's first 4 novels, those books, as well as his short stories and later novels, are drenched in religion. John's final published essay, God and Me, is the single clearest of his pronouncements on Catholicism. Again, he remembers the immense power of the church of his youth. I grew up in a theocracy in all but name, he writes. Churches in my part of Ireland were so crowded that children and old people who were fasting to receive communion would regularly pass out in the bad air and have to be carried outside. Not to attend Sunday Mass was to court social ostracism, to be seen as mad or consorting with the devil. In such a world, heaven, hell, and purgatory were as real to him as England and America. But this intense, unquestioning belief slipped away from him as an adolescent, so that, as he memorably puts it, he awoke one day like a character in a Gaelic poem and realized he was no longer dreaming. When trying to come to grips with an Ireland that was rushing to secularism, John feared that the more worthwhile and beautiful aspects of Catholicism would be lost in the race to cosmopolitan modernity. These fears are evident in the concluding paragraphs to his short story, Old Fashioned, when the Irish Church of the late 20th century is described in unflattering, depressing terms. The priest now faces the people, acknowledging that they are the mystery. He is a young priest and tells them that God is on their side and wants them to want children, bungalow bliss, a car, and colour television. Marcel Proust, 100 years earlier, had witnessed and regretted similar trends towards disregarding the traditions and lifestyles that the French church had created over centuries, and wrote of his worries in a letter quoted by John. I can tell you at Illier, the small community where 2 days ago my father presided at the awarding of the school prizes. The curé is no longer invited to the distribution of the prizes since the passage of the Ferry Laws. The pupils are trained to consider the people who associate with him as socially undesirable. It doesn't seem to me right that the old curé should no longer be invited to the distribution of the prizes. As representative of something in the village more difficult to define than the social function symbolized by the pharmacist, the retired tobacco inspector, and the optician, but something which is nevertheless not unworthy of respect. Were it only for the perception of the meaning of the spiritualized beauty of the church spire. I never found the church ceremonies tedious, writes John. They always gave me pleasure, and I miss them all. The movement of focus from the home and school to the church brought with it a certain lightness, a lifting of oppression, a going outwards, even a joy. If McGahern thought that his novels were more like prayers, he also professed far more interest in poetry than in prose fiction, as he proclaimed at his first public appearance in Ireland after the banning controversy, a November lecture at the 1967 Belfast Festival. Many of the events were centred around Queen's University Whitla Hall, where Seamus Heaney took to the stage to introduce McGahern. 5 years the Leitrim Writers Junior, Heaney spoke of the author of The Barracks and the Dark as, quote, a writer of courage and honesty. It was a year since the publication of Death of a Naturalist, Heaney's critically acclaimed debut collection with Faber. But the two men could not have known that morning that they would tower over Irish literature for decades to come. McGahern's opening comment set the tone not just for this lecture, but for his writing life. I am only interested in poetry, which occurs more often in verse than in prose. Rather than dwell on his own attempts at writing, McGahern chose that day to reflect on a mid-19th century short story by Herman Melville called Bartleby the Scrivener. McGahern identified strongly with the recalcitrant but courteous clerk at the heart of the story, who uses aggressive good manners to keep the world at arm's length. At the Belfast Festival, he urged his audience to see in Bartleby a kind of heroic teller of truths. What McGahern was keenest to stress throughout, and what Heaney later recalled when reviewing John's third novel, The Leave-Taking, for the Sunday Independent, was that prose of the type on display in Bartleby contains more poetry than most verse. I call Melville a poet, he told his Belfast audience, a distinct voice speaking out of a world of the imagination shaped in its own logic. This photograph was taken in Paris in the autumn of 1969. John's second wife was an American woman who owned this apartment in Paris. It still does. She's still alive, Madeleine, and I work very closely with Madeleine on the biography now. An examination of McGahern's library confirms his preference for poetry over prose, and it seems likely that his first efforts at creative writing were in verse. In July 1958, he sent a forlorn letter to his friend Tony Whelan, whom he had first met in a London hostel when working in construction, and with whom he shared an interest in writing. I still teach in Dublin. I often fear I shall grow old among the primers and children who care as little about learning as I do about teaching. Andrew Marvell, William Wordsworth, W.B. Yeats, Rainer Maria Rilke, T.S. Eliot, and Philip Larkin remained enduring favourites among the poets. Along with the letter, McGahern includes some attempts at poetry, bearing the clear influence of Yeats, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and especially of Patrick Kavanagh, McGahern's Irish contemporary. Typical is a poem which he titles "The Spoiled Poet Takes His Ordination Vows." And I'll just give you one stanza of it. No faith or love ordains me. I take the living death with hands that feel no flesh or blood in cups worn frail from centuries of use. Too much religion have my people, from rearing priests on stingy acres, till they have come too priestly now to root the bitter soil and breed. While the quality of the poetry itself gives us little sense of the prose master to come, the preoccupations on show remain constant in the early fiction. Religious vocation, failure to renounce the flesh for a life in Christ, the idea of human existence as a veil of tears. Shortly after the composition of these Prentice pieces, verse was cast aside for good, though McGahern always maintained a love for poetry across a wide variety of genres and times. Let's think a little further what McGahern might mean when claiming that The Barracks is not a novel, and that the vision is all that matters. As part of an American tour to promote Knopf's publication of The Dark in February 1966, McGahern agreed to give a talk at the Rockefeller Institute in Manhattan. What he delivered was a short lecture that was the closest he ever came to composing an artistic manifesto. Occasionally extemporizing, he stuck largely to the script as it eventually appeared in the magazine The Honest Ulsterman for December 1968 under the title of The Image. He read this piece out twice, spliced by a reading from chapter 20 of The Dark, in which young Mahoney and his father have one of their many showdowns, this time over the nature of prayer and whether it ought to be used to ask for direct divine intercession. After reading the piece for the second time, he takes a few questions from the audience before being asked to recite something of his own choosing, to which he responds after some thought with the opening stanza of Yeats's poem, The Wild Old Wicked Man. That McGahern should choose Yeats is not surprising, given his great reverence for his countryman's poetry and plays. And yet the choice takes on added significance in the context of the first public airing of The Image, working almost as a Freudian slip, through which McGahern allows us to speculate on the conception of the ideas contained therein. He had developed a fixed and unshakable devotion for Yeats, at least as early as his school days. His love for Yeats is confirmed in later years by his work alongside and great admiration for Donald Gordon, a Yeats scholar and professor of English literature at the University of Reading, where McGahern took up a visiting fellowship in the autumn of 1968. McGahern especially admired W.B. Yeats' Images of a Poet, originally an art exhibition and catalogue curated by Gordon and his colleague Ian Fletcher in 1957. The section of that book titled Persons and Places begins thus. For Yeats, nature and experience were a book of images. Places and persons that had most deeply moved him took on a further dimension of meaning. And here we get one of McGahern's favourite definitions of what art ought to achieve. Art that abolishes time and establishes memory. While Yeats's poetry is certainly replete with thoughts and representations of the role of the image in the creation of artifice, Gordon, in using the phrase, a book of images, is thinking specifically about Yeats's introduction to a book of the same name, in your slide here. A Book of Images, published in London by the Unicorn Press in 1898, consists of a series of line drawings by W.T. Horton, Yeats's friend and fellow member of the occult movement, the Order of the Golden Dawn, with Yeats's introduction speculating on the magical nature of art. So I've given you quotations here from both Yeats and McGahern. All art that is not mere storytelling or mere portraiture is symbolic and has the purpose of those symbolic talismans which medieval magicians made with complex colours and forms and bade their patients ponder over daily and guard with holy secrecy, for it entangles in complex colours and forms a part of the divine essence. We're getting close now to McGahern's thinking on artistic value. Like Yeats, he shares a suspicion of writing that is, quote, mere storytelling, and is always in search of deeper, more permanent significance. It's for this reason that he so infrequently fixes his work in an identifiable time. For some critics, this avoidance is condemned as an unacceptable failure to engage with the political, particularly as he was writing at a time when Ireland was in a state of turmoil. But McGahern, like Yeats, is unafraid of equating art with a kind of sorcery. All great writing has a spiritual quality that we can recognize but never quite define. Call it moral fragrance or style or that older healing word, magic. While Yeats sees the symbol as the magician's most effective tool, for McGahern, it is the image. This photograph here is taken from the McGahern archive in the University of Galway. This is the very original image as he scribbled it in pencil on his, probably on the flight to New York in February 1966. McGahern's urgent search for the lost image, as explicated at the Rockefeller, is something like this effort of Yeats to tap into a great memory. It's a process that is difficult to describe, and it's not surprising that McGahern is so hesitant on that first New York airing of something that he feels instinctively, but has not as yet fully rationalized intellectually. In the question and answer session that followed the reading, McGahern tried again to define the nature of his quest. Some single magical image that would simply absolve and reveal our state. I don't think it's possible. That's why I describe it as a false god, to reveal our state in language. We can only ask questions, they cannot be answered. Religion simply states that this image is God. John spent his writing life pursuing this image, this solid image. We see this right through from The Image to the final masterpieces of That They May Face the Rising Sun and Memoir. One 1992 interview sees him at perhaps his clearest on how that one clear image might work in the composition of literary art. I see the whole function of writing as circling on the image. The shape comes last. It is the intellectual quality in the work. Part of writing is technique, but it is only a part. You have to try to pick the image that's sharp, that can dramatize or bring into the light what is happening, be it a wedding ring or a Coca-Cola bottle or someone rolling an orange across the floor. As well as having technique, you have to be able to feel and to think clearly in order to find the right words. This pursuit of a solid image is reflected in the passage he chooses to read from The Dark at the Rockefeller Talk, the 20th chapter of the book, which revolves around an argument between the novel's central protagonist, young Mahony, and his difficult, irascible father about the rights and wrongs of praying for God's help while sitting exams. The father objects rather churlishly to his son's prayers. They argue, and young Mahony is left alone in the kitchen of the family home while his father retires to bed. And this is the quotation on your slide. The photograph is, The Dark has long been out of print in the US, but a new critical edition of The Dark will be published very soon, I think, from Syracuse University Press. And that's the new Dark there. Stupid vanity had caused it all. The house had gone to bed. You were alone in the kitchen. You wanted to say to him you were sorry, but you weren't able. His boots, wet from grass, stood drying by the raked fire. They started to take on horrible fascination. They were your father's boots, close to the raked fire. They'd been put there to dry for morning. Their toes touched where the ashes spilled out from the fire on the concrete, boots wet from the grass. Your father's feet had been laced in their black leather, leather over walking flesh. They'd walk in his hopes, be carried over the ground till they grew worn, past mending, and were discarded for the new pair from Curly's, on and on, over the habitual fields, lightly to the football matches in Regan's Field on Sundays, till the feet themselves wore, boots taken off his dying feet. And so it goes on, this meditation on the image of the boots for a further 18 lines. John's artistic technique of bestowing near-human powers on inanimate household objects might also be seen as being in communion with another of his masters, the German language poet Rainer Maria Rilke. In attempting to answer a question in New York on why he insists on just a single image, he refers the audience to Rilke's one novel, The Notebooks of Malta Loredz Brigge, and the moment in the novel when Malta's mother appeals to him that he must never forget to make a wish for himself. Moving from Malta's wishes to think of his own, John returns to the image. Things I have wished for myself that I'll never find is this one image from which I think my life in some form or other took its full expression, its most complete expression. Rilke, like Yeats, was devoted to the centrality of the image. 4 years after Yeats's introduction to Horton's A Book of Images, appears Rilke's Das Buch der Bilder, or The Book of Images. It's difficult to say when Rilke entered McGahern's orbit. The first letter to mention him comes from spring 1964, and through the 1960s he made generous gifts of both Letters to a Young Poet and the Notebooks of Malta Loredz Brigge to a variety of friends. A heavily marked up copy of the latter title forms part of McGahern's library. Of Rilke's essays, McGahern's favourite was Some Reflections on Dolls, the most searching treatment in Rilke of this idea of the strange power of the inanimate. And he's particularly thinking about dolls that are played with by children and are then left aside. What becomes of those dolls? Do they retain a kind of life? I pass over the intimate, the touching, the deserted, thoughtful aspect of many things, which, as I pass them, move me deeply by their beautiful participation in human living. I will only cite in passing quite simple things: a sewing clamp, a spinning wheel, a domestic loom, a bridal glove, a cup, the binding and the leaves of a Bible, not to speak of the mighty will of a hammer, the self-surrender of a violin, the friendly eagerness of horn spectacles. Indeed, only throw that pack of cards on the table with which patience has been played so often, and it forms at once the centre of melancholy hopes, which have long since been realised in ways not hoped for. Mahony's Booths of the Dark are viewed with that same sort of sympathy and human solidarity argued for by Rilke in the case of dolls, once loved and now abandoned. And so it goes throughout McGahern's work. Having considered some of John's stylistic decisions as a writer, I want to finish just with some thoughts on Catholicism. In John's dying days of March 2006, he contacted his distant cousin and friend, Father Liam Kelly, to ask if he would officiate at his funeral mass. Despite Father Kelly having noticed with sadness the obvious toll McGahern's cancer was taking on him, and knowing for a year previously that the cancer was terminal, he was shocked by the finality of the request. Some months earlier, McGahern had asked Kelly to check with the parish priest in charge of St. Patrick's Church, Aughawillan, in County Leitrim, to see if his funeral mass could be held there, and also to let the priest know that he wished to be buried alongside his mother in the adjacent cemetery. Over the next 3 weeks, Father Kelly visited him twice at home and once in hospital in Dublin, just 3 days before he died. Despite being very weak and unwell, McGahern was lucid, and the two men talked openly about his final wishes. He was philosophical about his impending death at the relatively young age of 71. And during one of Kelly's visits to his house, McGahern quoted from Yeats's Oedipus at Colonus: "Endure what life God gives and ask no longer span." Kelly was struck by this line and decided to use it and to add a few more lines from the same source in his funeral mass homily a couple of weeks later. It became clear that John wanted a traditional style funeral, a country funeral. John told Father Kelly that he had asked Luke Early, the undertaker in Mohill, whose pub he used to drink in, to look after the arrangements. He asked Father Kelly to contact Luke and select the simplest of coffins for him. John specified that he wanted the funeral mass to be simple, with no music and no eulogies. John warned Father Kelly in their chats over those final weeks that there was to be no artificial grass used at the graveside. I don't know what the American tradition is of how people are buried, but in Ireland sometimes the coffin will be lowered into the ground and then artificial grass will be put over the grave and the people will leave. John McGahern didn't want that to happen. He referred to it as butcher's grass. That is the livid green fakery some butchers use to display their meat. John also specified that the 5 decades of the rosary be said at his graveside, and that some of the local Aughawillan men be asked to fill in his grave with shovels in the traditional fashion while the people were still present. He knew the age-old wisdom that saying the rosary and shoveling the clay into the grave would take about the same time. And he knew that something similar had happened at his mother's funeral at the same place some 62 years earlier. He did not want to sanitize what was happening in any way by covering the clay with artificial grass and filling in the grave after everyone had left, as had become the custom. He wanted the thud of clay on the coffin to be heard by those present. Some of the bystanders tossed lumps of the wet clay onto the coffin with their bare hands. Father Kelly began his homily with references to the great English poet John Donne before moving on to more personal thoughts, and I'll conclude with those thoughts. Some of John's best writing, like The Seasons, is cyclical in nature, ending up where it began. And so it seems appropriate that we should gather for this funeral here in St. Patrick's Church in Ahawillan, where John came to Mass as a small child. It was here that he learned to serve Mass. It was here that he had his first brush with church authority, when, as a small boy, he was denounced for rattling his beads too loudly during prayer. There would be other brushes with church authorities later. And even though he was treated badly, he never held any grudges or traces of bitterness. He was bigger than that. The church was, he said, his first book, and he had learned much from it. He identified two parallel movements within Catholicism. One, the fortress churches with their edicts, threats, and punishments, and the other, the churches of the spires and brilliant windows that go towards love and life. The latter was his church, and he lived his life on the river that led towards love and life. Thank you.